That's where Prince's stomping grounds, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So, we should consider coming up with an NASA conference. 2 years. We're trying to bring it to Minneapolis.
I saw some. Is Kira out there?
Yes. Yeah. We get together a lot.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's family. I don't know, the Midwest, I can take it for like a few days.
I know. I hear you, man.
I need to see the water.
Okay, everyone, let's go and please begin our talk for today. Before we begin this evening, I would like to acknowledge the Tonga people and their ancestors, past and present. We are all guests upon their lands, which stretches west of Santa Monica, southwest of Long Beach, and south into Orange County. Sanamasi and thank you to the Tonga people. I would also like to individually thank Lupe Castaneda, Madeline Josiaco, Zane Kassam, Saralyn Morales, Lynn Miyake, Angela Mooney DRC, Asena Teoni Felihia, and Dom Ayu Tabor for their support of this program. So thank you very much, all of you. And Hapaday, good evening, everyone. My name is Alfred Flores. I'm an assistant professor in the Intercollegiate Department of Asian American Studies at Harvey-Mudd College. My co-organizer, Dr. Mike Manalo Pedro, who is also the director of the Asian American Resource Center, and I would like to welcome you to this evening, the first of 3 lectures that are part of IDAAS's signature event on the topic of militarization and decolonization. The IDAAS signature event is a program that expands upon our understanding of Asian American studies and issues through a variety of activities that have included things such as lectures, workshops, field trips, and community engagement opportunities. This year's topic on militarization and decolonization is based on the book anthology entitled Militarized Currents Toward a Decolonized Future in Asia and the Pacific, which is published in 2010 and co-edited by Setsu Shigematsu from UCR and Keith L. Camacho from UCLA. This anthology has encouraged us to think about the various ways that communities throughout Asia and the Pacific Islands have been affected by militarization, but have also responded through different acts and forms of decolonization. It is in this spirit that we have put together this signature event to learn how scholars one decade later are working to address these issues through their work. So now what I'd like to do is bring up ARC intern Dom Ayu Tabor, who is a 3rd-year engineering student at Harvey-Mudd College and is a member of the STEP Committee and the Pacific Islander Empowerment Committee.
My name is Dom Ayu Tabor. As Professor Flores said, I'm an ARC intern, and I work on the STEP Committee and the Pacific Islander Empowerment Committee. I just wanted to talk a little bit about STEP today, because I think it's a really important program, and I really enjoy doing it. So I've been involved with STEP for the past 3 years, and there's a large Tongan diaspora in the IE area, specifically like in and around Ontario. And we bring them to Pomona College every Saturday to tutor and host them for activities that they might not get the chance for otherwise. And we also feed them lunch. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about it, and also invite anybody, if you all are free and have capacity on Saturdays. We meet up at 10 a.m. usually in, spacing on the name,
Walker Lounge.
Walker Lounge on North Campus Pomona. You all are welcome to attend. But yeah, that's just a little bit about the STEP program. It's really awesome, the kids are great, and the community is also really great. I think it's a really awesome way for the kids to interact with their Tongan community and also interact with college. And with that, I would like to move on and thank the co-sponsors for this event, the Asian American Resource Center, the Pacific Basin Institute, and the Johnson Fund. And lastly, I would like to thank Professor DeLisle for coming in to share her knowledge with us.
Thank you, Dom. Appreciate it. Thank you. So now it's my honor to introduce Tina Taitano DeLisle, who is an associate professor of American Indian Studies at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. She is a CHamoru historian whose work focuses on the intersections of colonialism, militarism, indigeneity, and gender in the Pacific Islands. particularly in the region of Micronesia. She also researches and teaches in the field of global indigenous studies and heritage and museum studies, and has a strong interest in comparative Native women's histories and indigenous feminisms. DeLisle's book, Placental Politics, CHamoru Women, White Womanhood, and Indigeneity under U.S. Colonialism in Guam is forthcoming with University of North Carolina Press. Her current project examines the histories of U.S. national park designations, military narratives of conservation, and indigenous land struggles and stewardship in the Marianas. So let's please give a warm welcome to Professor DeLisle.
Marcy, you guys did such a wonderful job with the acknowledgement that I just wanted to give a special shout out to the organizers, and I want to thank especially Mike and Alfred. Alan helped with the logistics, but again, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here and such an honor. CHamoru women's histories are rooted in the land. Land is routed through the histories of CHamoru women's work. Literally, figuratively, genealogically, and cosmologically, the seeds of CHamoru women's labor are planted in and along the Taitano. I think I might need a little. No, along the Taitano, the Halamtasi, the Sisonzan, or the swamp, the limestone forests, the island savannas, the Lansu, or the ranch. Beneath the papasaki of homes throughout the villages of Guåhan, and among the Lati. For centuries, the island's patera, the midwives, would bury the placenta, or gatsum, ipatun, the child's companion, and the apudza, the umbilical cord, because they believed it steered newborns out of harm's way and kept them close to home. The social and cultural meanings, processes, and reciprocal relations of such embodied knowledge that ensured a child's safe passage in the world and that one never forgets home and roots are multiple and varied and run deep and wide in CHamoru conceptions of time and space and sense of place. Gimotna. This cordage and linkage between the indigenous people of the Marianas, the Chamorros, and the land, aptly captured in the vernacular Taitano, people of the land, becomes especially palpable and sentient in the generative storage sites and land narratives of the island's patera. For my talk today, I want to focus on such placental plantings, more specifically what I call an indigenous feminist placental politics, because of the way that such work signals a history of Native resurgence and resistance, CHamoru women's persistence. The inspiration and insight for an indigenous placental politics comes directly from how the patera, in defiance of U.S. naval orders to burn or discard the placenta, or the gatsum, the friend or companion, regarded by the Navy as toxic human waste. Because of the way they continue to do this and bury the child's gatsum, or allow family members to do so out of respect for deep CHamoru symbolic and cultural meanings connecting notions and expectations of self in relation to land and community in a system of reciprocal kinship relations and stewardship obligations. But it also refers more broadly to indigenous women's practices to ensure community well-being and women's health amidst inafamalik and amidst enduring colonialism. The first women in Oceania to confront the violence of formal colonization, CHamoru women of the Marianas since the 16th century have labored and led the wave of struggles through a sea and sky of islands to steward indigenous lands, waters, and communities and bodies. And yet, in much of the historical and contemporary accounts of Guåhan and the Marianas, they appear as nameless objects of Spanish conflict, conversion, and conquest, or assimilated subjects of American colonial modernity under the Navy. Even local and canonical historiographies, for the most part, have marginalized the dynamic and complex historical experiences of Chamorro women. In the epic encounters and entanglements and political clash and collusion between colonial and Chamorro men, Chamorro women often are like footnotes in a historical monograph, information germane to a story and needed for important backdrop or minute details, but not the principal characters or main agents of the narrative. Yet, footnotes, never simply ancillary, tangential, obscure, incidental, or inconsequential, are really an apt way to begin a history of Chamorro women. And not just to call critical attention to how women have been relegated to the margins of history, but also because of what footnotes connote. Footnotes do more than provide backdrop or exemplary information. They comprise the heart of historical narrative and ostensibly the content and form of the past, and highlight productive tensions between history and historiography. Yet footnotes in history can also be understood as footnotes as history, especially when the matter involves movements in history and movements as history, and most especially when the historical subjects of that ongoing history have been so obscured or marginalized as to have their own movements and mobilities arrested in the past. To follow the historical footnote of women's embodied land work, I want to draw today from my forthcoming book, which examines the complexities of this rooted and routed embodied labor and placental politics through the work of Chamorro women who were among the first to confront and negotiate U.S. colonialism. And here I'm talking about the midwives. Examples of these women would be the midwives and also the teachers. I'm a little behind on my slides. As some of the first to be hailed into the U.S. colonial project of public health and public education by way of the Navy's recruitment, training, and employment of them, these women were also the descendants of an even longer line and circle in keeping with Chamorro's circular conceptions of time-space, of Chamorro women confronting and resisting 300 years of Spanish Catholic colonialism. So the book actually centers, the starting premise is to do this history that has been marginalized. But the book also expands and complicates the histories of Chamorro women by examining their labor as enmeshed and entangled in early 20th century philanthropy and feminism of white middle-class American Navy wives. To be sure, placental politics as decolonial history is my bid to advance the critical indigenous feminist project and responsibility of decolonization, especially as articulated by native Tanana Athabascan feminist scholar Diane Million, when she writes that, quote, to decolonize means to understand as fully as possible the forms colonialism takes in our own times. I'm aware of a propensity in the image of a placental politics to idealize a return to nature or maternal, biological, reproductive, or even heteronormative utopia. This is not my intention, but rather I'm interested in how the social and cultural histories of Native women's embodied labor under the Navy, how it can relate, and how it relates to land can inform ongoing and current struggles and the new colonial and settler colonial landscapes in my native homeland of Guåhan. So what I wanted to do today is to really give a glimpse of the early 20th century gendered landscape of U.S. colonialism, and then how women, give some examples of how women negotiated these spaces, drawing on archival but also mostly oral histories that I conducted with some of the island's last surviving patera. And then I want to just explore and kind of move on to how this native-inspired theory and practice decolonial practice of placental politics can inform what's happening now in women's activism against the latest military buildup in Guam and development there. Following the Spanish-American War and the signing of the Treaty of Paris, Spain relinquished its colonies in the Marianas, ceding Guåhan to the U.S. and selling the Northern Marianas to Germany. U.S. President William McKinley issued an executive order which placed Guam under the control of the U.S. Navy. In his orders to the island's first naval governor, Richard Leary, McKinley described the terms for establishing America's authority over the island as one of benevolent assimilation. This new mission and mild sway of justice over the old arbitrary rule, what Vicente Rafael calls the sentimental reworking of the divine gift bestowed on a putatively pioneering race under manifest destiny to the return of that gift overseas, was predicated on winning the confidence, respect, and affection of the Chamorros by securing them in every possible way with the full measure of individual rights and liberty, which is the inheritance of all free peoples, right? This is Leary's language, while also McKinley's language, while also making sure to repress disturbance and to overcome all obstacles to the bestowal of the blessings of the government. A U.S. Navy report of Guam retrospectively described the civilizing and modern project of benevolent assimilation on the island as the long road to rehabilitation. This benevolent long road of gift-giving came in the form of public health, public works, and public education, and the instruction of English. And it entailed the transformation in the bodies and the minds of Chamorros and delivering them from a disease-ridden medieval peonage to the dignity and demeanor of a healthy, self-reliant citizenry in the modern world. For the Navy, this peonage was the result of 300 years of Spanish quote-unquote misrule, which left the island listless and decimated, and the Chamorros a spiritless and mongrelized population that only the U.S. under the Navy could resuscitate. The first in a litany of white male naval colonial governors to rule the island from 1899 to 1941, Leary interpreted the benevolent long road in a number of different ways. Leary promulgated nearly 24 edicts meant to change the social and cultural fabric of Chamorro society and Inafat Malik. In Chamorro society, deep traditional values are housed in a key cultural code called Inafat Malik, and literally it means to make good, which denotes, and Inafat Malik also denotes making something good or right, but it also connotes balance, kind of like Afakanakamali Pono. Woven into the Inafat Malik code are other values considered tadung, or deep, and with their own connotations of substance and wisdom. Tadung, deep practices include gai mamalau, literally to have shame, but loosely to save face, and chinchuli, a form of payment to somebody in need as a way of creating and maintaining a form of reciprocal exchange and ongoing indebtedness. Chinchuli was and is based not on U.S. capitalist wage-based economy, notions of wealth and accumulation, nor the gifts or gift-giving of benevolent assimilation, but debt reflecting interdependence and reciprocal the relations of community and stewardship obligations, starting with childbirthing and child-rearing, which encompass non-biological modes of reproductive labor. In the context of women's health and childbirthing and midwifery practices and the surveillance of women's bodies, the military passed a number of policies starting with the licensing of lay midwives. Upon completion of a course in elementary gynecology and antisepsis, midwives would eventually be required to renew their licenses every year and to undergo formal training and examination under the Navy in English, in a foreign language. What the Navy did was basically usurp the power and efficacy of the lay midwives. And what it did was recruit and train younger, seemingly more pliable naval trained nurse midwives. But as my work actually, as the book actually shows, you know, or as we'll get a glimpse of very shortly, even those trained under the Navy didn't simply capitulate to colonialism, but in fact, they re-inscribed Chamorro notions of progress and ineffable to make good. Meanwhile, the Navy's long road entailed the emptying and later confiscation of Chamorro lands. This emptying, according to Australian Indigenous feminist scholar Aileen Morton Robinson, is the process by which the possessive logics of patriarchal white sovereignty disavows and dispossesses the Indigenous subject, both confined and conscripted within modernity, and yet always outside the white logic of capitalism and progress and development. In this emptied and depopulated landscape in Guåhan, according to Anna Torrey, the Navy rendered Chamorro men absent on account of widespread epidemic and Chamorro-Spanish warfare, and asserted power and fecundity over Chamorro women as bearers of the race. The island, Torrey argues, was feminized not only as a terrain from which men were literally absent, but as a, quote, space available for the colonial penetration of a masculinized naval establishment, unquote, in which it saw its mission as one of rehabilitating the Chamorro race. A 1928 ad wanted American farmers. In the Navy publication, the Guam Recorder exemplifies well this feminized emptying and expropriation of Chamorro lands. Upon closer read of the ad, a call to reputable and experienced farmers who wish to settle on this island of Edenic virginity, we might begin to ascertain the beginnings of what Patrick Wolfe called settler colonialism's logic of native elimination. This settler colonial logic, as native feminist scholars Miley Arvin, Eve Tuck, and Angie Morrill argue, is a gendered process and project of disappearing indigenous structures of governance and kinship, gender roles, and sexuality, all key to making indigenous peoples into settler state citizens. The process of emptying, securing, and domesticating the female land was the colonial vehicle through which the Navy subjected Chamorro men, women, and children to American agriculture and sought to replace Chamorro conceptions of land use and relations with the land with American notions of developing the land and economic development. In its reference to virginity, in its references to virginity and Edenic virginity, the Navy-run Guam Chamber of Commerce, composed predominantly of white American men and really restricted to men at the time, engendered Guåhan female in need of seasoned white American male propagation for the good of the inhabitants and needs of the world. Indeed, the Navy's perception of thousands of acres laying waste gives us an indication of the clash between native and foreign military colonial desires of land, of and for land. In its vision of progress and development, the Navy also deemed certain women as the path or means for helping to deliver order out of chaos. The Navy would find this in a cohort of young Chamorro women, like the would-be nurses, like the patera, and teachers who exhibited enthusiasm and eagerness, and again, supposedly pliability and malleability. In order to understand Chamorro women's negotiation of the gendered landscapes of early 20th century US militarism in Guam, we need to be mindful of the distinct but also non-mutually exclusive gendered landscapes of Costumbran Chamorro, right? So it's not like the military comes and it's got this empty slate, right? But it's already having, it steps into this existing deep, long Spanish Catholic tradition, right? 300 years, and indigeneity on top of that. The set of local customs produced by an historical amalgamation, Costumbran Chamorro that is, right, of indigenous Chamorro and Spanish Catholic values and practices after centuries of Spanish colonialism and Catholic presence in the Marianas. As Chamorro scholar Laura Souter writes in her early and important book, Daughters of the Island, before the war, young women rarely left home except to attend church activities. though even such sanctioned activities were conditioned on women being chaperoned. According to Sauer, costumbre in Chamorro, prescriptions were a product of Spanish colonialism's emphasis on female chastity and submission, coupled with Chamorro women's further retreat into the home and their proper place as taught and engendered under this new system, right, of U.S. naval colonialism. Though the Navy's presence began to offer a few women, like the patera and the teachers, opportunities to enter public spaces and domestic work, as domestic workers, barmaids, again, teachers and nurses, and thus break with tradition, physical and discursive mobility was still confined by a Chamorro Catholic social order of domestication and domesticity. Chamorro women were socially constructed between two contradictory, and this is what Laura Sauter demonstrates in her book, really two contradictory and diametrically opposed subject positions. On the one hand, the Madonna-like lady on the pedestal, and the Dama de Noche, or woman of the night. And some of you may recognize this, right? Very similar virgin whore dichotomies figuring some of the other work like Chicana feminist scholar Sherry Moraga. Similar virgin whore dichotomies obtain in ethnographies and oral histories of Chamorro women. So I'm talking about other work that has come out on Guam. The American anthropologist Laura Thompson, for example, in her ethnography of Chamorros, based on her field work in the 1930s, observed that many young unwed women were expected to join the Daughters of Mary Society, which promulgated a strict code of chastity and rules prohibiting unaccompanied women from leaving the home. The only legitimate reason a woman might leave the home, Sauter writes, especially at night, would be to attend these functions of the Daughters of Mary Society. Sounds really exciting, huh? And with the chaperone at that. As Thompson writes, except for a few prostitutes and bar girls, only the most modern girls of Agana, and that's the capital of the island, including some nurses and school teachers and house girls, defied such traditions and conventions. In her history of the Blessed Mother, the Santa Maria in Cumberland in Guam, the Chamorro, which is the Chamorro adaptation of the Virgin Mary, right, but in Guam, Marilyn Jorgensen traces the emergence of the sodality of the Children of Mary and other devotions of Chamorro women to the Blessed Mother, such as the Little Miss December 8th and the processions in which devout Catholics are invited to walk with Mary. Now, given these gendered prescriptions, right, anything that deviates out of that, right, one of the implications of young Chamorro women, right, in not joining the sodality is that not only is she regarded as having chosen not to walk with Mary, but perhaps even to walk away from Mary. I want to share, I really want to share some examples with, so I want to share some examples, oral history, some of the interviews I conducted, and oral traditions that really demonstrate and illustrate, I think, real well what Chamorro women were up against, and to some extent are still up against. So here's an interview I did with Joaquina Balta Herrera, a patera, a midwife, who was trained in the 1930s. And here she's writing. She says what she's really describing here is the desire to go, right, and what it took, the fortitude that Chamorro patera had to really have in order to cross those boundaries, transcend those boundaries, right, costumbre and Chamorro. And she says, the parents before, they don't want their girls to join the nurse to become a nurse, because some of them, they said, if you became a nurse, you're a puta. Because the corpsman and the nurse are working together. And this old-fashioned woman thinks that the corpsman and the nurse are going to be together, right? But she explains, right? She says, they didn't get it. They're not together. We're just kind of working together and we're training together. We're not like going to go sleep with them and have sex with them, right? So here's she describing the dilemma for some of these would-be patera, anybody interested in becoming a nurse midwife. Likewise, Chamorro folklorist Carmen Iglesias Santos transcribed and translated the following pre-war Cantan Chamarita, this very early tradition, right? Songs, right? Which is a kind of bantering between Chamorros. But I won't read it in its entirety, but what I want to emphasize summarize is that this here is it's called Humalan Infantera, right? Enrolled as a nurse. But really what it describes is how the Navy fooled Chamorro women, one particular Chamorro woman, and it's most likely that she was talking about a very specific Chamorro woman, right? But not giving the names. It's a song that mocks her, right? And says, you know, she goes with it. She gets tricked by this military man, goes down south. They also go to Tuman, which at the time was not really a place where proper women would go because a lot of the military hung around in Tuman, right? In fact, before the war, the military relied so much on that place, central part of the island. It's like you can compare it to like Hawaii's Waikiki, right? There were so many military. So a lot of the young Chamorro women did not go to Tuman, right? Of course, that would change, and I'll talk about that very shortly. But eventually she gets pregnant, right? And the blame is placed on her, right? For she enrolled as a nurse. Returning to the gendered landscapes of US militarism in Guåhan, the best example of this imperial and violent reworking of indigenous territory, besides the most obvious case of possessing it as US property and denying Chamorro self-determination, was a notorious post-World War II Cold War policy of requiring all travelers in and out of Guam to be subject to military clearance, which amounted to military surveillance of civilian residents. In 1941, President Roosevelt issued an executive order that established the Guam Island Naval Defense Sea Area and the Guam Island Naval Airspace Reservation, and which also authorized the commander, U.S. Naval Forces Marianas, to govern the conduct and movement of all persons on the island of Guam, regardless of whether or not they had violated an order. The Navy would eventually lift the security clearance in 1962, ending 21 years of its monitoring of civilian entry to and from Guam, but not before causing some resentment among Chamorro travelers. Senator Richard Taitano, the first Chamorro to be appointed director of the Office of the Territories in the United States Department of Interior, what is now actually the DOI's Assistant Secretary of Insular Affairs. He recalled being really angry for having been stopped and questioned on a return trip or a trip to home from Washington, D.C., and all the while watching American female taxi dancers breeze through security clearance. Right? So that really gives you a sense of that gendered landscape under U.S. militarism. A similar level of monitoring of travel along gendered lines also occurred on the island in this time period. A June 1946 memo from the island's civil administrator to the island's command provost marshal, or the military police, reveals that of the 100 registered vehicles listed on the island, only one of these, a Jeep, was registered to a woman, the Patera Maria Taitano Aguero. Oops. Yeah, you can't see it, but she's like the fourth name on the list, and she's the only one, right, in all these vehicles that have been registered under the U.S. military. If naval colonialism added a new level of monitoring movement to and from the island and within the island as a form of domesticating indigenous Chamorros, especially women who were still confined to or enclosed by the realm of domesticity in the older tradition of Costumbran Chamorro, some women, like the Patera, Tanmari, and Dogi, the woman on the list, would not be kept and contained in their supposed proper places, but instead they would remain on the road, going village to village, doing the work of the Navy, but also more importantly, continuing to do the work of Inafat Malik and utilizing U.S. naval accoutrements and technologies, right? The Jeep, in this case, to do so. The confinement of women's work and place is in large part owing to the traditional terms of Chamorro matrilineage and their obligations as Hagen Hagat, blood daughters, or cultural caretakers. Under these traditional terms of matrilineality, Chamorro women controlled titles and rights and claims to resources, especially land, and hence have historically wielded an enormous amount of power. Presumed deviation from their obligations were often associated as cultural or social negligence, betrayal even. But as the book argues, as I show in the book, it was precisely in their mobilities that Chamorro women like the Patera and early women educators like Agata Johnston would continue to be rooted in naval practices and also routed in their embodied land work of pinaksai, of steering. This is a Chamorro term for, it literally, poksai means to adopt, but it also means to steer and to steward and care for people and places. 4 dimensions exemplify well placental politics and their negotiations of U.S. naval colonial modernity. A politics that, again, I want to emphasize, steeped in nafat malik, literally to make good, and Native women's conceptions of propriety and progress in areas of health and hygiene and compensation. The Patera's desire and resolve to transcend boundaries and cross over and back from Chamorro Spanish Catholic proscriptions around proper women's place. And you know, the interviews, like the interview with Taitano, right, where she talks about the risk of being called a puta, right? The Patera's ability to serve as gatekeepers and cultural brokers, working, negotiating, and massaging, translating the spaces, right, between the Navy, right, naval spaces, but also Chamorro spaces. And also the Patera's insistence on appropriating new ways with age-old Chamorro beliefs and practices. Amo Chamorro medicine, right? They continue to do this, right? This is something that was kind of under the radar of the Navy, right? And the Navy might have thought that these are really silly folklore, right, practices, but they really, they were very powerful rituals, right? And they were also ones, contrary to what the Navy thought, that also said, if you're going to use this Chamorro medicine, you also can't use this, you also can't follow what the Navy is saying around health and hygiene and other kinds of prescriptions, right? So it was mitigating against that, right? And another dimension really that exemplifies well, I think, placental politics is the Patera's, finally, the Patera's management of compensation. So here's another interview that I conducted with Rosalia Mesa, or Tanlin, right? And in this, she's actually, you know, if you'll read along, right? And I want to highlight here the use of the word maulik, right? As in inafat maulik. So she's basically talking here about the Navy's orders to bring in Chamorro women. In order for the Patera to deliver their babies, they had to first avail themselves to the Navy doctor, right? This prenatal check. And here Tanlian's articulating these, what I'm saying are native notions of progress. And in Malik, you find it very, very Malik advice. Her use of the word Malik invokes, again, deep meaning in Chamorro, the performance of what is good and what is right for the community with connotations of balance and harmony. With connotations of, again, what is good under the terms of Inafat Malik. Clearly, a significant part of the Patera's labor, duty, and obligation was to translate the idea and significance of prenatal care, routine visits and monthly checkups to monitor conditions like high blood pressure and eclampsia, and something Maulik, as something Maulik, and to assure patients that they would be with them throughout, right, their pregnancy, even if it meant at times putting these women's needs first over family obligations, right? So nowadays, when you find midwives, midwives today, that kind of role that midwives take today is very different from what these midwives do, right? What you get essentially is rotating midwives, right? And just the idea of midwives sounds kind of cool, but what you're not getting is the kind of care and attention that traditional midwives or nurse midwives trained under the Navy were giving women, right? Even if it meant being away from their family, and even if it meant traveling to the southern part of the island, right, by boat cart. Of course, another practice maintained by the Patera was the burying or planting of the placenta, the gatsung. Tanliang learned this from her great aunt. According to Tanliang, the proper burial of the gatsung in a puza, the cord under the stairs of the house or near the house, ensured the child would be protected from injury and malevolent spirit as they grew older. Even Tankina, who herself had reservations about this tradition, respected a family's desire to practice these precautionary rituals. The conscious decision by Patera to defy naval orders and instead to bury or plant the placenta and allow family members to do so in order to maintain and ensure values of Inafat Malik, to guide one's growth and development property, also explains why and how the Patera handled compensation the way they did. Though the Patera saw the potential to earn money in this new space, right, under the Navy, working for the Navy, they often acquiesced to other forms of compensation. For instance, the law stipulated a fee for her services, anywhere from $2.50 to $10, and yet the Patera did not adhere to such wages by the Navy. Tenanan Sabotis qualified this amount as coming from the heart, right? The Patera practice of accepting whatever families were happy to give, and I'm quoting Tenanan, countered the Navy's modernizing and rehabilitating efforts to establish a cash-based economy and transform Chamorros into productive wage earners. And even though the law gave the Patera the right to refuse a delivery if she anticipated non-payment, they rarely, if ever, at least none of the women that I interviewed, refused a delivery because a patient could not pay. To do so would have been culturally inappropriate, right? Contra Inafat Malik. There are other ways that they received compensation, and if anybody, maybe in the Q&A, if anyone's interested in that, and I can share it, right? That really mitigated against the Navy's efforts to turn Guam into a cash-based economy. The Patera's insistence on the old while practicing the new suggest what I call a Chamorro placental politics of the past and for contemporary struggles in a new round of U.S. militarization and development in Guam, but also more generally for indigenous feminism and indigenous feminist practices. In the new and ongoing forms of U.S. colonialism and militarism in Guam, similar but also different registers involving Chamorro women's embodied knowledge and sacred practice with the land abound. Redolent of the historical and cultural positions assumed by pre-World War II Chamorro women laborers, contemporary Chamorro women activists have redefined the political and cultural terms of Chamorro womanhood, gender, and indigeneity, and have staked renewed roles as stewards over the lands and communities in a new and unprecedented Pacific pivot, right? This is what the new build-up is referred to in Guam. Unprecedented, too, is the potential killing power of the military arsenal and technology to be deployed to Guam in the post-9/11 era of anti-terrorist global militarization. And in August 2000 oversight hearing on the U.S. military buildup, members of the multi-ethnic women's organization Fuatsin Pamalawan, Strength of Women or Strong Women, invoked an image of Chamorro stewardship even deeper and older than the godmother, right? Which is actually the role that many of these earlier Chamorro women would assume in taking care of Chamorro communities. They invoked an image of the Magahagat, right? The first daughter. Literally the first daughter, but also conveying a high-ranking woman of ancient Chamorro matrilineal society. The Magahagat wielded tremendous power and authority. Drawing upon this strength and command, Fuatsin members insisted that any discussion of the buildup needed to be accountable to the needs of women and children, and to the health of the land and sea. A day later, at another hearing, Fuatsin leaders reminded federal officials and local leaders of the military's destruction and contamination of lands. They called specific attention to the devastating environmental effects on the southern and northern villages of Santa Rita, near Naval Air Station, and Jigo in northern Guam, which is near Anderson Air Force Base, whose residents suffer the highest incidence rates of cancer. A form of indigenous feminist truth-telling, Guåhan testimonies, unlike others that day, also highlighted the unresolved issue of Guam's political status as an unincorporated territory, colony of the US, and the federal government's continued denial of Chamorro self-determination. Much like the way pre-war Patera were duty-bound and obligated to care for women before, during, and after birth, Chamorro women in the historical present practice and act on Inafat Malik and assume responsibility to make good, to make right. As a reminder of this obligation, some members actually prefaced their testimony in opposition to the buildup with the adage, Isanya itumung sa hatsedi ki azaw imismo, umisagwihao. Greater is the fault of he who allows the injustice on himself. At a time when the U.S. military insists it is committed to being a good steward of the environment, right? And this is the language now that's changing. This is the narrative that's changing with the U.S. military in Guam, right? Being a good steward, right? and caring about making Guam, at one point called the buildup in tandem with the government, right? One Guam, green Guam, right? So that sort of environmental, kind of evoking environmental concerns and justice. At a time when the U.S. military insists it's committed to being a good steward of the environment, in supposed equal partnership with Guam and the island's leadership and local tourism industry, under a new grant of what Teresia Tewa called militarism, right? Militarism and tourism working hand to hand in tandem thrust. That embraces co-ops and deploys Chamorro culture even, right? Chamorro women of different generations reassert older and deeper political, social, and cultural roles and meaning involving the sacred while challenging colonialist, patriarchal, and settler state narratives of national security. How much time do I have? 9 minutes? Okay. I want to show a clip, right? And I think it's really important. This is a map of Guam, right? And the island owns roughly about a fourth of the island currently, right, in red. And Guam to this day still remains on the UN's list of non-self-governing territories. But I want to show a clip of from a hearing in 2017, and this time to discuss, right, so the military's looking for a new place for its live fire training complex. And this is a hearing that was conducted at the Guam legislature, and I want to play parts of it, a clip from it, right?
About our community, we don't want any more harm to be caused in our community, so we're asking questions.
By one of the descendants of the Texan.
We all came here today because we care about our community. We don't want any more harm to be caused in our community, so we're asking questions, and you're providing us with answers to the best of your abilities. And speaking about mitigation, I hate that word mitigation because I keep hearing it over and over and over. But we don't care about your mitigation. We don't want this firing range at Northwest Field. We don't want it over Retidian. We want it taken off the table. And if you don't agree with us, and if you can't work with us to come to a solution that we can all agree on, then the only way that you would build this range is really over our dead bodies, because this is not moving forward.
So this is like a big deal, right? This is a descendant of one of the original landowners of Retidian, right? The military wants to take the Texan to use it for a live fire training complex, right? And she's confronting the commander, Naval Forces Mariana. That's a kind of big deal, right? You don't usually see this happening, right? you know, this is especially in the context of I don't know, of course this is like 30 pounds later me, right? Especially in the context, right? What's happening, you know, you have every year, you have celebrated on July 21st, right? You have Liberation Day, right? Which is honoring the return of the Americans, right? To save Chamorros, who saved Chamorros from the Japanese, right? And every year, on July 21st, the island celebrates this, right? And every year you have, from throughout the villages, a representative, right? A Chamorro woman, right? I had to do this because somewhere down the road, someone's going to out me, right? You're like a Liberation Day princess, right? But I think it also puts me in a really good spot of taking the narrative of Liberation Day on, right? As somebody who was really directly implicated in that, right? But I want to return to that earlier clip, right, with Maria Hernandez, right, just, you know, forcefully looking at the commander. In asserting we don't want any more harm to our communities and demanding that the military take quotidian off the table, Hernandez not only changes the rules of engagement, she asserts an indigenous stewardship accorded with the land, willing to lay its life on the line and on the land. More than mere testimony, Hernandez's confronting of the Navy Admiral is an example of what Aileen Moreton, to quote Aileen Moreton Robinson again, right, calls talking up to a white woman. As the book demonstrates, Chamorro women now and then have always confronted the work of American midwives and military women in new and old forms of power. In in another instance of anti-colonialism and demilitarization, Manmagahagat women leaders on August 14, 2011 convened a gathering at Guåhan in central Guåhan, commonly referred to as Gun Beach because of the presence of a World War II Japanese anti-aircraft gun there in the island's tourist sector of Tumon. Guåhan is the site of Linatlat, the island's first cultural and eco-theme park. The 8-acre Linatlat boasts a nature trail, a zoo, a 500-year-old Chamorro village. Adjacent to the park and ancestral site is the beach bar, right? Same owners, right? Which is frequented by the military. So again, you have this kind of convergence of militarism and tourism. The village in vintage natural history form exhibits primitive static depictions of Chamorros. The park traffics literally on Chamorro culture from its name, Linatlat, life, living, being, to the fact that it sits on top of a Chamorro burial site. In the process of building a cultural heritage and ecological park, the developers not only disturbed human remains and artifacts, including funerary objects, but also left the remains in an unmarked and nondescript pit adjacent to a nearby parking lot. The developers' desecration of burial site is legitimized through a prior history of land condemnation and what the military, right, this is the language, it's already been disturbed, right? The land has been disturbed. This they did for a park that would subsequently boast a living diorama, right? So go figure, an actual ancestral site and then building on top of it, right? Like an authentic Chamorro village. Where tourists and visitors can experience Guam life and culture from 500 years ago. Once again, the depth of place, in this case Guåhan, the Chamorro concerns for Inafak Maulik, furnish the occasion and material for Chamorro women to correct things. In a sunrise ceremony called Chinachalanin Imananaita, creating pathways for our ancestral spirits, to rectify the recent desecration of the burial site, the aforementioned community leader, former senator and educator, and now farmer Hope Cristobal explained that because the grave sites were disturbed, so too were the Aniti and the spirits. Women, she maintained, as mothers and daughters, needed to offer peace and tranquility to the Saina, to the ancestors who passed down sovereignty and human rights. In what might now be understood as a placental practice of maintaining genealogical cordage to land and ancestry, Cristobal merged ideas of indigenous political self-determination and sovereignty with a long tradition of Inafa'maolek and stewardship and Chamorro women responsible for the well-being of community and land. The presence of another Magahagat, Chamorro language activist Bernadita Camacho Dunca is really noteworthy here. In 1991, she composed the Inafresi, a pledge to protect and defend the beliefs, culture, language, air, water, and land of the Chamorros. From the innermost resource, innermost of the mind, right? Innermost recesses of the mind. To be sure, Chamorro women activists have deployed Inafa'maolek in a form of placental politics, and I'm talking about now contemporary Chamorro women activists and stewards, evocative of an earlier practice rooted in indigenous conceptions of self in relation to land and community, but one that is up against new forms of militarization, right? So new forms, modernization and settler colonialism. For my presentation today, I have given a glimpse of an earlier history and contemporary politics, placental politics, of Chamorro women in their obligations as nurses, as teachers, godmothers, stewards, Magahagat, right? Such images embody the historical and political forces and motives which, as Teresia Tewa speculated, have driven indigenous women across the Pacific, right? Not just in Guam, but across Oceania, to come to political consciousness and take up activism after the bodies of their loved ones become affected and infected by large and previously mysterious forces like nuclear contamination. Placental politics, for me, adds to this history and this possibility. Placental politics, as I see it, names a history and a future by which indigenous women have consciously chosen to act as stewards of Chamorro peoplehood and place. In Guåhan's history, Chamorro women's practice of planting the placenta and the umbilical cord was a knowledge that connected Chamorros to land in order to ensure proper growth and directionality. Perhaps what has also driven Chamorro women to protect land and bodies is the physical and psychological effects of watching military maneuvers over our children's gachum, right? Or over our children's placentas. Chamorro women activists also continue to care and steward Chamorro peoplehood and land in efforts to keep things right and balanced and to sustain what is Inafa'maolek and Maolek. Sidus Masi, thank you.
Okay, we have a little bit of time for some Q&A, so should we just open it up?
Yes, yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. One question I was on mind, to what extent did the Patera consider themselves as Suruhana or not? Were they engaging in the same type of activity? Were they totally separate?
So to what extent were...
Patera conceiving of themselves like Suruhana? Or was it a totally separate location?
No, it wasn't actually. In fact, and I'm sorry I didn't have a clip of her, but Taitano and Sabotis was a very famous Patera of Suruhana. Yeah. So there was this sort of, we're still kind of figuring out what the distinctions were, right? Even earlier, people who practiced, right, like the Makana and the Kakana, but there's not and for that matter, Suruhana, who were also massaging, right, and treating women who were pregnant, right? So this is sort of crossing over. I think, and what's really exciting now is a lot of Chamorro, there's a younger generation that are studying to be Suruhana, right? But also learning the traditional medicines that were used for childbirth. I didn't get your first name.
Oh, Brandon. Hi.
Brandon, good to meet you. Yeah. Any other questions? I'd love to hear comments.
Well, I'll ask. What other ways are the women on the island using a sort of non-capitalist, modern ways to compensate one another or exchange services and goods, other types of... So
what other ways are women, non-capitalist, right?
Yeah.
Well, so So here's one, right? Like, I think you still, there's not, post-war you don't have the nurse midwives, the patera, but again, some women are actually, younger generation are learning that practice, right? But one of the things that really countered that, and I think we can still look at this today, right, is for services rendered, right? There's also times when the one who delivers the services goes further into debt, right, because of that relationship. For example, the patera often would be paid in what I describe as godmother, right, godmother payment, right? I can't afford to pay you, but I'm going to make you my child's godmother. And anybody who's a godmother, right, knows it's like, it's a lot of money, right? So there's an example that, non kind of capitalist, but it's not just money, but it's also bartering, right? And in fact, giving things from the lansu, right? Produce. Other examples, but good question. Yeah. I realize my talk went a little over, but I just wanted to, assure you that if there's any questions that you have or comments, I would love to. We could exchange emails, and I would love to, have that conversation with you over email. But I saw another hand go up.
So I'm really interested in, your conception of placental politics as a form of continuity. Is there any ways that you were able to detect on the period you focus on, the early American period, ways in which this concept has changed, maybe in its encounter with, for instance, Spanish Christianity, but in some way that dialogue, right, of ways of those two epistemologies, did placental politics change? And can you see that, in the early 20th century? Is it hard to discern?
Yeah, I think so, right? I mean, so placental politics, right, with the women that I interviewed, right, what was really, what figured prominently in their sort of narrative about women's health was also Spanish Catholicism, right? And even to this day, if you have, 98%, is it still, Catholic communities, right? I don't know if it would still be that high, actually. There's a strong Catholic presence, no doubt, and tradition in Guam still. But I think what you're seeing is a more of a defiance in that kind of, in the way that women go about stewarding the land, right? Where these women wouldn't be as outward, openly defiant to the military, like that clip that I showed. You're beginning to see that now, right? And what might be actually construed as high respect to no respect. You're talking to the military like that, right? But what you're seeing in a younger generation, or not so much, not just younger generation, but in this milieu, right? With this new buildup is a defiance, right? Or a refusal that you just simply didn't see pre-war, right? In the kind of placental politics of, say, Agatha Johnston, prominent teacher, or the patera, right? These are the women that I look at in the book.
Are there any specific ways that demilitarization movements in Guåhan are collaborating with or engaging with other demilitarization projects across the Pacific and Oceania?
Would you mind repeating a little bit?
If there are any other ways that demilitarization efforts in Guåhan and some of the things we've talked about today are kind of engaging in solidarity work with other communities in the Pacific that are doing similar processes?
Oh yeah. Kanakamaui, there's a lot of back and forth solidarity standing walk, right? And American Indian childbirthing, right? So, different kinds, right? Cultural, but also political, right? And in New Zealand, right, around land, Mauna Kea, right? The struggle to protect Retidia or Litexan, those activists and those protectors of Litexan actually being in conversation with those who are the protectors of Mauna Kea.
All right, well, thank you very much. As Professor DeLisle said, she'll be around for a little bit of time. We'd like to talk to her individually, one-on-one. Just last two things we're gonna plug, or last thing I'm gonna plug the last two, speaker number 2, which is Yenle Espiritu on Monday, February 24th, same room, same time. And Thursday, March 5th is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. So thank you very much for coming everyone tonight, and have a nice night.
Thank you.